It's good to be back to speaking to a live audience and also some other people out there in the ether. And the topic I've chosen today hopefully is fairly relevant to what's been going on over the last couple of years. And the starting point was an article that I had published in the August 2020 Beecraft. If you've got a copy, it's worth looking up because there are some useful references to some of the papers that I will refer to. So, of course, the starting point for all this was this beautiful organism here. This is a virus, and of course this is severe acute respiratory syndrome coronavirus 2, SARS-CoV-2, which of course is the organism that causes coronavirus disease 2019 or COVID-19, and the reason why things have been upset over the last few years. But not everything has been bad in the last few years. It's forced beekeeping associations to move into the 21st century in terms of how to communicate with their audience, but also it's drawn the attention of the public around the world to the general biological principle that moving biological material around the world is not a terribly good idea. Biologists have known this for quite a long time, and there are numerous examples of things going wrong when you move biological material around the world. In this case, over the last 18 months, we've realised that people moving around the world can transmit disease very rapidly and very effectively. And of course, bees are no exception. So in terms of bees, I want to start by introducing an organisation that, as was said earlier, I've been involved with for quite a long time. And this actually came together in 2008 as a small group of mainly European researchers with some money from the European Union as part of something that's called a cost action to get scientists to come and talk to each other, to meet, to discuss ideas and to organise research. And it was specifically to look into all the reasons why honeybee colonies around the world are suffering excessive colony losses. And of course, it was prompted by what happened in the United States with colony collapse disorder from 2006 onwards. And as I say, it started out as this little group of European scientists, and the initial money ran out in 2012, but it was decided that it had been such a success that it was worth pursuing. And so in 2012, it was decided to continue. And Collos now has over 1,700 members around the world, and these are bee researchers, but bee extension specialists as well, covering 104 countries around the world. And it's now set up as a non-profit association based in Bern in Switzerland. And it has many different groups within it called task forces and core projects to look at all the different possible aspects of the question of colony losses. And one of these, founded relatively recently, but of course very relevant now, is a group on viruses. And this was just a picture of the COLOSS conference last week. And my colleague Fleming, who's in the audience here, is on there somewhere over here, I think, organising the quiz at the social evening, and Kirsten Trainer, who spoke earlier, is on here as well. The last couple of years, unfortunately, it hasn't been possible to have physical conferences, but hopefully next year we will be back in Serbia for a physical conference. But one of these groups that is within Collos is solely concerned with the question of viruses. And quite by coincidence, in 2020, a couple of important review papers put together by members of this group came out and really do put the matter of bee viruses in some kind of context and show us what's going on. So the first one of these was called Diversity and Global Distribution of Viruses of the Western Honeybee, Apis mellifera, put together by this group of scientists from many different countries who are all members of this virus group. And it's worth looking out, this paper, but I just want to put up one illustration here, and this shows 4 maps of the world and 4 particular viruses. So top left we have black queen cell virus, top right we have deformed wing virus, which is the principal virus associated with the varroa mite and the principal reason worldwide why colonies infested with varroa die. Bottom right, we've got sac brood virus, which turns up from time to time. And bottom left, of notable interest, it's called the ABP complex, and that stands for the Acute Bee Paralysis Virus complex. Now, acute bee paralysis virus is one of these viruses that was first identified by my former colleague Bill Bailey at Rothamsted in the 1960s and 70s. Lots of work on viruses at Rothamsted. And he, from samples sent from Europe, isolated this virus, which was called acute bee paralysis virus, to distinguish it from an earlier virus they've been working on, chronic bee paralysis virus, which I shall come to in a minute. And acute bee paralysis virus is called that because it kills bees very rapidly, only a few days after you inject them. Then later, he was sent samples from Asia, from Kashmir, and he isolated something which he called Kashmir bee virus, which appeared to be quite similar and seemed to be vaguely related. Then in 2007, when there was all the hoo-ha about colony collapse disorder in the United States, researchers in the United States looked at colonies that had died from this supposed disease, colony collapse disorder, and they found that they were heavily infected with a virus called Israeli acute paralysis virus, which I'd never heard of at the time. As its name implies, it was isolated by some researchers in Israel a few years before, and again was closely related to acute bee paralysis virus. And we now know from molecular studies that these 3 separate viruses are all closely related, and they're now put together as a complex, and they are regional variants of the same virus. And over the last year or so, we've become very familiar with the idea that the COVID-19 virus has regional variants, and of course, bee viruses do the same. The reason for this map is that it shows the distribution of all these viruses. They are spread around the world, but in the case of the ABP complex, these individual viruses occur in places where they wouldn't naturally occur. So acute paralysis virus was European, seemingly. Kashmir bee virus was from Asia, seemingly. And Israeli acute paralysis virus was first isolated in Israel. They are all spread around the world. IAPV was causing problems in North America, but the implication was that it may have got to America from samples from bees sent from Australia, where clearly it's not native either. And the story here is that these movements of viruses have been due to movements of bees. And so all 3 of these regional variants of this particular virus now occur in the UK. And they could not have got here naturally. They could only have got here by movement of bees around the world. So moving on to the second of these review articles, again by people from the Colloss virus group. This is about bee viruses, but it's not only about honeybees. It's about Hymenoptera, so ants, bees, and wasps, relatives of honeybees that can be important. And I've just put this one diagram here to show the modes of transmission. And unfortunately, my pointer's not very good. So for those of you here, I shall try and point, but for those of you listening remotely, I shall try to explain it. So in the middle here, this thing is a flower. Imagine this is a flower. On the top right, you have social bees, your honeybees, and you can see that they visit the flowers. They can transmit a pathogen within their colony. They can transmit a pathogen to other honeybee colonies nearby, which can also transmit it within it. Down the bottom, you have semi-social bees. You have the bumblebees there, which are also visiting the flowers, but may occasionally rob beehives. You then have their social parasites, the cuckoo bumblebees that can be involved in this. Down the bottom, you have wasps, which will visit the flowers, which can rob honeybee colonies, and which can visit other insects. Down here you have hoverflies, which may visit the flowers and may pick up these viruses. And then on the left you have all the solitary bees. You have the ones that live in the osmias and others that live in hollow tubes, in wood. And you have the ground nesting solitary bees, the andrinas and all the others. These are visiting the flowers. These will be picking up viruses and passing them on. So many things have been called honeybee viruses simply because honeybees have been more studied than other species. And there's a huge debate about the degree to which honeybee viruses may be transmitted to bumblebee colonies, for example. And the implication is always that the honeybees are the bad boys and girls that are transmitting these things. But that may not necessarily be the direction of travel. These things are much more complex, and we know that several honeybee viruses, such as black queen cell virus, may have, a slow paralysis virus, may have in fact have originated in bumblebees and then later been transmitted to honeybees. So these relationships are much more complicated than they may at first appear. I then want to move on to another virus. I've just mentioned it briefly already. This is chronic bee paralysis virus, and this is an actual very old electron micrograph of chronic bee paralysis virus, and you can see it's not a beautiful three-dimensional regular structure like the COVID virus. It's this strange sort of blobby thing, and it's actually quite unusual for an insect virus. But this is important to us because it causes bee paralysis, and in fact, there's writings of ancient Greek writers which refer to paralyzed bees, which may possibly have been chronic bee paralysis virus. More recently, or 100 years ago or so, this was almost certainly the organism that caused the famous Isle of Wight disease, which was alleged to have killed many of the honeybee colonies in this country. And my former colleague, Leslie Bailey, studied this years after the event and came to the conclusion that most of the research that had been carried out in the 1920s or so that pointed the finger at the tracheal mite Aecorapis woodi, which was discovered at that time and which was implicated. His conclusion was that most of these, the conclusions made at the time were wrong, that the tracheal mite does not cause the symptoms of the Isle of Wight disease, but he was able to demonstrate that chronic bee paralysis virus, which was, of course, totally unknown at that time, does produce the symptoms of the Isle of Wight disease. And he was able to demonstrate that at the time, 100 years ago or more, there was a huge density of honeybee colonies. There was a sequence of years of very poor weather where bees are confined to the hive, which is the perfect opportunity for chronic bee paralysis virus to be transmitted within the hive, and that caused a huge, what appeared to be an epidemic, but in fact was a disease that had been there all the time, but circumstances caused to be a big problem. And then latterly, for a variety of reasons not related to the disease, the number of colonies fell, the incidence of the disease was greatly reduced. This is a very old photograph from Bailey showing a healthy bee on the left and the two variants of the disease on the right. This bee with a distended abdomen, and then this bee with a shiny, hairless bee, a robber bee, seemingly as was described by the ancient Greeks. So a lot of interest in chronic bee paralysis virus in the 1960s, and then its incidence seemed to decline, and certainly my colleagues at Rothamsted very rarely found it when they looked at samples of bees in the 1990s and so on. But in recent years, a lot of commercial beekeepers in particular have been pointing to an increase in the effects of chronic bee paralysis virus. And Giles Budge, who used to be at the National Bee Unit but is now at Newcastle University, has been doing a lot of work on chronic bee paralysis over the last few years, and I'm hoping he will come to Harper Adams not next year but the year after to tell us the results. But he published this paper last year, which is really quite interesting. And so he's called it Chronic Bee Paralysis as a Serious Emerging Threat to Honeybees. And interestingly, he doesn't mention the Isle of Wight disease at all, and doesn't mention that it was a problem in the past, but it's the same disease. But what he found is really quite interesting. So the top graph is showing the incidence of chronic bee paralysis virus in samples collected by the National Bee Unit, and it starts in 2006 there up to 2017, and you can see that there is indeed a significant rise in the incidence of this disease. But the interesting one is the one at the bottom, which divides all those results into 4 different categories. And this is, bearing in mind, this is results from inspections by the National Bee Unit. They've divided it up into the groups where they randomly decide to visit an apiary and collect samples, and the ones where they were called out by the beekeeper. And then they divided it into 2, the commercial beekeepers and the amateur beekeepers. And the results show that significantly the commercial beekeepers had higher incidence of chronic bee paralysis virus than the amateurs. And that may be related to this colony density idea that I've mentioned before, that commercial beekeepers tend to have more colonies in a given apiary than amateurs do, and commercial beekeepers may have more apiaries closer together than amateur beekeepers may do. But in the text, he specifically says that there was a higher incidence of chronic bee paralysis virus in those beekeepers who were importing queens. And then this next series of diagrams are quite interesting too. And this is going through the years. And you can see this is a heat map. And the dark green at the bottom is where not much is happening. And then you've got yellow here up to red. And what you can see is that this clearly isn't a consistent thing over time, but you can see the map is becoming more yellow as time goes on. But specifically, you've got things like here where there is nothing there, and then in this year you get a sudden hotspot of the disease appearing, which over the next few years disappears again. And the same thing happens here and here. You have these hot spots for a few years, which then trail away. And this does not suggest that it's an endemic disease that's present everywhere, which we know it is, but that there is, if you like, a new infection from a point source. This is behaving as an infectious disease, not as an endemic disease, and it seems to disappear after a few years. And this fits in very much with the idea that this disease is being imported in different places at different times. So there are several possibilities to explain these results that Giles and his colleagues have obtained. The first one, the simple one, is that the disease is directly brought in imported bees. Well, it may be, but as we know, the disease is here already. It caused a big problem 100 and however many years ago. So, it is probably immaterial. However, it could be that imported bees are more susceptible to local strains of disease. And what do we know about this possibility? Well, actually, we now know quite a lot. So coming back to the Colloss organisation that I mentioned, it has, as I say, various groups. And one of those groups is devoted to the question of bee breeding, the idea that perhaps one of the reasons why beekeepers are suffering excessive colony losses around the world is that they're keeping bees that are not suitable for the places and the conditions they're keeping them in. And so a few years ago, they hit on the idea of carrying out a comparative experiment to compared different strains of bee from different places under standardized conditions. And as was said in the introduction, I've traveled the world a bit, and I've talked to beekeepers in many different countries. And one of the things that strikes me is that beekeepers love a good argument. And particularly if they've had a few beers or a glass of wine, they argue intensely about things. And the thing they argue about more than anything else probably is this idea that one strain of bee is better than another. But until recently, that kind of argument was completely pointless because it was based on, no good scientific basis at all. It was trying to compare apples with oranges. So the idea of this Collos experiment was to directly look at the interactions between genotype, that is the different strain of bee, and their environment. So it's called the Collos genotype-environment interactions experiment. And the idea was that in 16 different places around Europe, they tested 16 different strains of bee. And these were tested under standardized conditions for a period of 3 years or so. So all these locations around Europe, they studied 3 strains at each, the local strain of bee, whatever that was, with 2 other strains from within the experiment. So, for example, down here in Portugal, they didn't pick bees from Finland and try to compare them. They picked ones that they thought should do well under those conditions. And so I think they had 12 colonies of each of them they started out with, and they studied them under the standard beekeeping practices in the area. The only different thing was that they didn't treat for varroa. And they left them, studied them very closely, and saw what happened. And lots of things were measured, and there were lots and lots of results. And in fact, there is a whole special issue of the journal that I used to edit, published in May 2014. And all the main papers of this are available open access, so please look at them. I'm only going to show one graph from all those pages and pages and pages of results. And this is the key finding. So what we have here is the survival of colonies. So it's cumulative survival. So up here on the left, we start at 100% or 1, the colonies we started with. Along the bottom, we have time in days. So this is over 3 years, as I say. And all of the 625 colonies that started out are on this graph. And for this purpose, they have been divided into the local bees, whichever they were, and the non-local one. And you can see that almost immediately the 2 lines diverge, and they are statistically significantly different throughout the experiment in terms of survival. So the non-local bees did not survive as well as the local ones. Now, why would that be? It's quite difficult to tease out exactly what's going along, but there is a clue in slightly more detailed studies that were done at one of the Greek sites where they looked at individual pests and diseases, and they found that basically all of the common bee diseases occurred at all of the sites, although the incidence varied. But what was the key factor was that the local strains of bee seemed to be better able to resist those pests and diseases than the non-local ones. And the conclusion really is that not only are there local strains of bee, but there are local strains of disease present at a site. And that if you bring in bees from elsewhere, they will be less well adapted to the local strains of pests and diseases that you have. They may be marvellous where they came from, but you move them around the world, they may be less resistant. So that was all from Europe, where the honeybee is native and has had a long time to get adapted, and it's reasonable. You know, we know there are local subspecies, and it seems reasonable that over time locally adapted variants would have evolved. But of course, that isn't likely to be the case in somewhere like North America, where we know the honeybee is not native and where honeybees have only been there for a few hundred years. But interestingly, a paper that came out fairly recently shows that even in North America, where the honeybee is not native, the same applies. So this was by some people in North America based in Vermont, And they did a similar sort of experiment where they compared some of the local bees from the northeastern United States with commercially available bees probably bred in Florida or somewhere, which really is very different conditions indeed. And they found roughly the same results. So the top diagram here relates to nosema, and you can see that right the way through the experiment, the local strains of bee have lower incidence of nosema than the non-local ones. And the bottom one is Varroa, and the arrow points to where they treated them. But you could see there was a difference in Varroa incidence before they treated them, and then the Varroa population didn't really recover through the experiment. But this next one relates to viruses and is much more convincing. So on the left, we've got deformed wing virus, the one associated with Varroa that I've mentioned before. And then we've got black queen cell virus. And on the right, we've got Israeli acute paralysis virus, which I've already mentioned as being the one implicated in colony collapse disorder. And you can see there is a huge and statistically significant difference between the local bees and the non-local ones. So this idea of local bees and local adaptation even applies in North America. So let's think about these non-local bees, and let's think about some other non-local bees. How many non-local bees turn up in this country? How many queens are imported into the UK? So I was involved in an EU-funded project called EuroBest, which has just come to an end, and there was an interesting final conference earlier this year, and all the talks from that conference are available online free of charge if you want to listen to them. But I was involved at the start in a little piece of research that the EU wanted to do. They wanted to know about the market within the EU for reproductive material of European honeybees, so queens, nuclei, packages. They wanted facts and figures for imports, exports from all the countries of the EU and nearby countries. And it was really, really quite interesting to put together. Now, I don't have time to talk about it here, but I just want to look at England and Wales from this data that we put together at that time. And over the period from, I think that belongs in 1994, to 2017, when the study was finished, you could see the number of queens imported from third countries reached a peak in the early 2000s and then declined. But over that period, the number of imports from EU countries greatly increased. And if you put them together, you get the green line. And it shows that there's been a huge increase in the import of queen bees into England and Wales in the last 10, 15 years or so. And traditionally, imported queens used to be from Hawaii, part of the USA, Australia and New Zealand for many, many years. And then they started coming in from Argentina. And then data from this Traces database showed that just in 2017, there were something like 17,000 queens or packages from various EU countries, Denmark, Greece, Italy, Romania and Slovenia, but also many others. So why has there been this dramatic increase in queen imports in the last few years? I don't know. I really struggle to explain why this has happened. It isn't that there's been a huge increase in the number of beekeepers in this country, because there hasn't. It simply seems that people really like importing queens and introducing them to their colonies. It's possible that people teaching beekeeping are telling them telling new beekeepers that you need to replace your queens regularly, which is one thing, but perhaps they're suggesting that you should use imported queens. And equally, we know that there are a number of commercial companies that have been set up specifically to import queen bees over the last few years, and perhaps are aggressively advertising these to people. So I don't know why. But let's put this into context. So the UK hive count, which has been done for the last few years, suggests that we have about 250,000 honeybee colonies. And to put that into context, I mentioned that 100 years ago there were lots of honeybee colonies, Bailey suggested there might have been 1 million honeybee colonies in Britain 100 years ago. So we've got 250,000 now. But this 16,000 queens coming in is only 6% of the total. And talking to people, I guesstimate that perhaps 10,000 queens are reared in England and Wales, and I've been told about 2,000 are produced in Scotland. So maybe 5% are replaced per year, which suggests to me that some 89% of UK hives have queens of completely unknown origin. So I've talked about importing bees. What about the native honeybee? So the native honeybee used to be something called Apis mellifera mellifera, the dark European honeybee. And depending where you come from, it has different local names. So depending from where you're from, this is the English or British or Irish or Cornish or Welsh or Scottish black or indeed brown bee. So I prefer to call it the dark European honeybee. And this is a map that was put together to show the native range of the important bee species we know about. And Apis mellifera mellifera was formerly present across most of northern and western Europe. And this map includes the British Isles and southern Scandinavia. And then further down, I should press the right button. Further down, you've got the Italian bees here in Italy, and the Carniolan bees in former Yugoslavia, Slovenia, and so on, and then other strains. And these strains in particular have been imported into the UK over the last 150 years and throughout Europe. And I was prompted about 15 years ago to write this article with the question, are honeybees native to the British Isles? And I went through all the historical, archaeological and biological evidence that I could come up with to say whether or not the honeybee is native to the British Isles, to counter an argument being made by some professional conservationists that the honeybee is not native to Britain. It was imported possibly by the Romans or the Normans. And anyway, if there ever were any native honeybees, they were all cleared away by the Isle of Wight disease 100 years ago. So there are none now. And the idea about all the bees being got rid of 100 years ago, really I think we have to pin on Brother Adam, notable beekeeper from Buckfast Abbey in Devon. I think a brilliant practical beekeeper, and this is his book, Beekeeping at Buckfast Abbey, which I commend you to read. He was, of course, most famous for producing the Buckfast bee, that I shall come on to in a minute. But he was also very famous for promoting the Buckfast bee, and he partly did that by saying that there were no native bees left, and if they were rubbish anyway. And of course, when he started beekeeping, he was working with native bees before the Isle of Wight epidemic. And he actually writes in his book, "The old English brown bee lives today only in the memory. Some 50 years ago, she fell a victim to the acarine epidemic and was completely wiped out." So I think I've already talked about the acarine epidemic, tracheal mite, not being responsible for the Isle of Wight disease, but also his conclusion that the original native bee was completely wiped out is not borne out by the contemporaneous evidence and not by the evidence we have now. Next, I want to introduce you to this man, Andrew Abrahams, who lives on the small Scottish island in the Inner Hebrides of Colonsay, and he contacted me about 15, 20 years ago because he was convinced that he had pure black bees on Colonsay, which he wanted preserved, and he was worried about other people bringing other strains of bee onto the island, and he wanted to find some way of protecting them from other bees being brought in. And his interactions with Scottish Natural Heritage at the time were extremely unhelpful, and they were of the view that it was a shame that there were honeybees on Colonsay, but if he wanted to get rid of them, they would support that, which was the total opposite of what he was trying to achieve. To cut a long story short, he has in recent years managed to get legal protection of his bees on Colonsay, and there's now an order made under the Scottish Wildlife and Countryside Act that prevents anyone from keeping any other strain of bee on Colonsay than the dark native honeybee. Andrew was convinced that his bees were pure native. This is one of the very first pieces of molecular evidence that was produced, some study by Boves Pedersen and Annette Jensen in Denmark in 2005, and they collected samples from really all about Europe, and you won't be able to see the lines on here, but this is one of these dendrograms showing the relationship between all these bees. And so at the bottom you have Apis cerana, a different species of honeybee. Then you have the Mediterranean bees, the Italian bees, and the Carniolan bees are here at the bottom. And it's worth noting, in between, more closely related, you have the African strains of bee. And then all these ones up here are dark European honeybees from various different places. And you won't be able to see it, but the Colonsay bees are genetically distinct, but related to bees from England, from Ireland, and from elsewhere. And you have Scandinavian bees here, various, and you in fact have some bees from Tasmania, which we know were imported from England and where there was a population of black bees. So his bees are indeed genetically distinct, and there's further evidence here from another study carried out by Alice Pinto in Portugal and various colleagues, and they were looking at supposedly protected populations of dark bees, protected in various ways of the red dots. And so Andrew Abraham's bees in Colonsay are here, and the bees in Læsø, which is a little island off Denmark, which are legally protected, are on there. But there are also two unprotected populations. These ones down here from England are bees from Sussex University, which I collected, and admittedly I did pick the blackest looking colonies to send as samples, but nonetheless they were sort of are ordinary bees, and a population from France which were thought to be native bees but not protected in any way. And the blue diamonds there are reference samples of Italian and Carniolan bees. And this diagram here, suffice to say, each one of these vertical lines is a colony. Over here you've got the reference samples. The ones in yellow and red are the Italian and Carniolan bees. The blue is Apis mellifera mellifera. We have samples from Norway here, which turn out to be very, very pure indeed. Scotland, this is Andrew Abraham's bees, which again proved to be very pure Apis mellifera mellifera. And then we have samples from Denmark, Switzerland, Belgium, and France. The ones over here with lots of red in them and yellow are these bees from Southwestern France, which were thought to be native dark bees, but turn out to be anything but. They weren't, basically. But the ones on the extreme left are samples from England, from the University of Sussex. And bearing in mind that our bees are not protected in any way, there are lots of other beekeepers in Brighton that we know of, and, you know, they're open mating. We were quite pleasantly surprised by the amount of Apis mellifera mellifera in our bees from Sussex. And then moving on, it's unfortunately a very poor diagram, but this is the only access to this data that I have. You may remember that the National Bee Unit some years ago carried out a random apiary survey where they went round and collected samples from a very large number of colonies and tested them for disease and all sorts of interesting things. And one of the things they did was to look at the genetic makeup of the colonies. And that data, unfortunately, hasn't been officially published yet, but a lady called Catherine Thompson did a PhD at the National Bee Unit and Leeds University, and she had access to some of this data, and it's in her PhD thesis. And you probably can't see this, but this right hand here is the background population from the random apiary survey, and it showed that the background managed colonies in the random apiary survey, average Apis mellifera mellifera content was 41.9%. And it was consistently the most commonly occurring thing in the samples. So most of the colonies in the random apiary survey are basically Apis mellifera and mellifera with other things. And the other things that may be the majority, but there's a lot there. And when she looked at remote populations in islands and so on, she found that was much higher than in the background. Then moving on to Ireland, there was a recent survey from Jack Hassett and colleagues, and they concluded that Ireland probably has the largest surviving population of Apis mellifera and mellifera in Europe, with the exception of bees living in the Urals in Russia, which are living in trees in the wild, basically. But sadly, countries like Germany and parts of France and so on, that this bee was originally native, there's very little left. It's been replaced. And this is some of Jack Hassett's survey, and this is similar to the diagram I showed you from the previous experiment, but they've chosen completely different colours to represent the difference. So here, the sort of yucky green colour is Apis mellifera mellifera, and it essentially shows that the samples from Ireland are pretty pure Apis mellifera mellifera, with a few exceptions which I mentioned, and are closely related to European populations of Apis mellifera mellifera, but when you look more closely, you find that Irish populations have distinct genetic characteristics not shown elsewhere in Europe. In other words, these are unique Irish variants of Apis mellifera mellifera, which belies the story that, oh yeah, all the bees in Ireland came from the Netherlands and so on. Well, this suggests that that's not the case. And all this has been done at a time of growing interest in native bees. So the organisation BIBA, originally the British Isles Bee Breeders Association, now the Bee Improvement and Bee Breeders Association, has been working for many, many years on establishing local breeding groups. And we've had other offshoot organisations in recent years. The Native Irish Honeybee Society was formed a few years ago specifically to look at bees in Ireland. We've got a Scottish Native Honeybee Society, specifically working in Scotland. And down in the West Country, we've got the B4 project, where B4 is bringing back black bees. And Joe Widdicombe, who was talking yesterday, is heavily involved in B4 project. And a few years ago, they established what they called as the first black bee reserve at Mount Edgecombe Country Park. And Mount Edgecombe Country Park is at the end of the Rame Peninsula where Joe Widdicombe has his bees. And this is really, this is a public park owned by the County Council and the City Council, and it's really to bring people's attention to the idea of native bees in the southwest. And the project has close links with the Duchy of Cornwall and many local landowners, and there's a lot of interesting stuff going on there. But I can't not mention the buckfast bee. What about the buckfast bee? Well, it was first developed by Brother Adam at Buckfast Abbey, specifically for his purposes of producing bees that are really big and strong at the time that the heather harvest takes place. And yet he managed to market it to people all around the world as the ideal bee for them. He was a brilliant salesman, I think. And so I looked on the internet and looked for pictures of buckfast bees, and here's one. You can see it's sort of quite sort of pale orangey with black bits, and then there's this one which is quite black, and then sometimes they're really quite yellow, and sometimes they're combination, and sometimes they're quite brown, and sometimes they're yellow and brown. And of course what this shows is that the buckfast bee, whatever its origins at Buckfast Abbey in Devon, has been developed by different breeders in different parts of the world over many years. And if you talk to the buckfast breeders in Denmark or in Germany, I'm sure they will show you their pedigree all the way back to Buckfast Abbey. But nonetheless, they have been selecting them under their local conditions for many generations. And the bees they have and that they sell will be different from the ones that originally came from Buckfast Abbey. And I think I've put buckfast there in inverted commas, and I think this is what we should do. The term buckfast just means a hybrid bee, and it may have fairly variable characteristics depending on where it's from. So what about other imported bees? I've said that most of the bees imported into this country over the last 150 years were Italian bees and Carniolan bees. How should we regard those? And going back to this map, we've talked about Mellifera, we've talked about Ligustica and Carnica, but we've also got little islands in the Mediterranean, Sardinia, Sicily, Crete, Cyprus, Malta, all have their own local strains of bees, and all of these have been harmed in recent years by imports of bees from Italy, from Carniolan bees, and from elsewhere, and their local little island populations are even more threatened than our big island population in here. But what about the Italian bee itself? Surely that's safe, there's no problem there. Oh, hang on, before I get to that. A couple of years ago, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature got quite interested in the idea that these Italian and Carniolan bees actually should be regarded as invasive alien species in the EU. And so two colleagues of mine, Maria Buga in Greece and Per Krieger from Denmark, were asked to put together a report. And they don't reach conclusions at the end, but it's worth reading this. And in many ways, these two strains of bees do fit the criteria to be invasive alien species in the places where they're not native. So it's quite an interesting point to think about. But to come back to, well, it was a second ago before I realised that slide was coming up. Think about the Italian bee in Italy. This is an interesting paper that just came out very recently, and this is looking at the bees in Italy, looking at their DNA. So you would expect that all of the bees in Italy would be Italian ones, which are the lineage of, called the C lineage in the way these are. And if you look on the left, you can see that the green is the C lineage, the Italian bees you would expect, but there are also crosses with others. So down here in Sicily, there's quite a lot of African influence, and that's not really surprising because Africa's on the other side of the sea, not very far away. But you've got M, which is the Mellifera bees as well. And so on the right, we're just looking at the, on the right, we're just looking at the, in the middle, we're just looking at the African ones here. And even in northern Italy, there's quite an influence of African subspecies. And on the right, looking at Mellifera, we're complaining about Italian bees polluting our Mellifera. But look, they've got lots of M strain bees in northern Italy and even down to the south. So even in Italy, there is introgression from other strains of bee. So, what bees do UK beekeepers want? Well, a couple of years ago, DEFRA, I think at the prompting of Joe Widdicombe and other people, put out a survey asking beekeepers what they want. And I don't have time to go through the results, but suffice to say, most of the people who responded to this survey said that, yes, they are actually quite interested to know where the bees they buy come from. They are interested in the rearing of native bees, and they would be interested in buying native queens if they were available. But then the final questions on would you be willing to rear such queens, only a very small proportion said they would. And this, unfortunately, is the problem we have. And we have to look at queen rearing in Britain and Ireland. And as we found, few beekeepers practice queen rearing. There are actually few commercial queen rearing operations, and actually very few beekeepers buy queens. So why is bee breeding and queen rearing so difficult in Britain and Ireland? Well, of course, a big factor is the weather, and then we've got the weather and the weather and the weather. And this unfortunately is the problem, and that when doing queen rearing in Britain, even if you do everything right, it can all go horribly wrong through no fault of your own due to the weather. And as part of this Year Best survey, we asked people in different countries to say how long their queen mating season was. And surprisingly, in some countries like Poland, where there are huge numbers, vast numbers of queens reared, they listed a very short mating period. And it's obviously a mating period where you produce your queens, they get mated, bang, done. In Britain, the mating season is most of the summer, but there isn't a particular time in that you could guarantee to get good success. And I think this is the real problem. So are these imported bees better than the local ones? Well, lots of people will tell you they are, but again, there's very little objective evidence. And going back to the Collos GEI experiment, there's this data from one of the papers in there looking at honey production, and it does indeed appear to show that the Italian and Carniolan bees in the project produced more honey than the others. But you need to beware of this data because there was a bias in the way that the sites were set up, in that the places where you expect to get high honey production due to climatic conditions were the places where these strains were being used, and the places where you expect to get a poor honey yield were the ones where the other ones were produced. So there's not a huge amount of evidence to support the idea that these strains really produce more honey. So the future of bee breeding of Britain and Ireland, I think, relies on having a real organised structure to bee breeding, and we don't have at present. I think the way forward is through local bee breeding groups, and many people in this audience will not have sufficient colonies to do breeding themselves, but they're all part of associations which working together can do. And I think we should be working with local bees, and I think there's a good case for a national bee improvement programme, and Joe Widdicombe mentioned this yesterday, and you can find more information about it on the BIBA website. And then just finally, to bring things up to date, of course, things moved on early this year, and in February, we had headlines like this: an unintended consequence of Brexit is that millions of bees could be destroyed over import rules. And what this was is that with us leaving the European single market, England and Wales became a third country, or the EU became a third country as far as England and Wales are concerned, and therefore you couldn't import package bees or nuclei. And a particular bee farmer decided to get round this by importing bees into Northern Ireland, which is still part of the European single market. And this caused a certain amount of disquiet, shall we say, and the national beekeeping associations of Britain and Ireland got together for the first time to say this is a bad idea. And if we look at the data, it shows that the imports of queens into England, Wales and Scotland this year were greatly reduced, and that there were no packages and no nuclei, which is great. But in Northern Ireland, there were three batches of 500 packages imported into Northern Ireland. About 40 stayed there, but the rest were exported to Great Britain. The first batch was inspected, the second batch was not inspected, and the third batch was apparently inspected by the bee inspectors in Great Britain. John Hill, who gave me this data from the Ulster Beekeepers Association, was unable to discover how many queens were imported into Northern Ireland last year. So what will happen next year? I don't know. Only time will tell. And my last slide is that actually, back in the EU, in Ireland, in fact, this was Wednesday of this week, a bill was introduced into the Irish Senate to ban imports of non-native bees into Ireland. Now, we were always told that this could not be done in the UK because we were a member of the EU. Ireland is still a member of the EU, and the attempt is to do this through conservation legislation. It may take a couple of years, it may fail, but it shows what can be done. And so I should just stop there. Just to conclude, the best bee for you is probably the one you have already. That's not to say that it can't be improved, and you can make great progress by culling out the bad ones.
Do you think then that we can, as beekeepers in the UK, actually make some kind of government cry out that we want to prevent imports coming into the UK?
Well, there's no harm in trying. It has been tried before, but write to your MP, see what they say. There's nothing to lose and everything to gain. I think the example that is going on in Ireland at the moment may be a way to go. We were always told that Brexit will bring great opportunities for us to do our own thing. So perhaps take that line with your MP and see what happens.
We've heard the talk about the various viruses and so forth. What about EFB? The increase in EFB up and down the country, including Scotland now, is that's a major operation. Now, is that basically being caused by importation and mixing these strains?
I'm not the expert on this. Giles Budge at Newcastle and the National Bee Unit has done a huge amount of work over the last few years, and hopefully he will come and tell us. But you've got similar things going on there, undoubtedly. There's a great variety in the strains of European foul brood that are around, and historically, the UK has been quite unusual in regarding it as an important disease, and most other countries don't regard it as important. But in recent years, in Switzerland in particular, they found it's a major problem. So it's a very interesting and mysterious organism. So Giles Budge is the person to answer that question, really.
Norman. I think we'd all agree who try and improve our bees that one of the things we fail to do is to cull enough colonies, right? I have never discovered a good way of culling a colony that is reasonably humane, shall we say. I mean, the bee inspector method of pouring petrol into a colony virtually prevents you from using any of those combs in there again, and is not particularly humane. The only thing I have found is just to kill the queen and make sure that no emergency queen cells survive, and let the thing peter out. But it all can take a very long time to do. Sometimes you can just do it by requeening a colony, but I am always slightly aware that you may be giving there may be inherent problems in that colony, particularly in relation to viruses, that may be a disadvantage to a new queen. I mean, I'm not saying there is, I'm just have you got any advice on this aspect?
Yeah, I mean, I think you largely answered your own question, actually. I mean, I don't know why you would want to kill the colony, and I have never deliberately killed a colony. I may have accidentally killed some colonies over the years, but I've never deliberately killed a colony. Whereas you can get rid of the queen in 2 seconds by squeezing her between finger and thumb, and then if you take all the brood out and put in brood from a better colony, they should, if they're in suitable condition, requeen themselves, or you could introduce another queen from another source. I wouldn't waste those bees. If you're worrying about disease, the chances are any disease you've got in one colony is probably in every other colony in the apiary anyway. So I wouldn't waste those bees, but equally I wouldn't want to tolerate bad colonies, whatever they may be, whether it's susceptibility to chalk brood or bad temper or anything else. Yes, cull out the bad ones as quickly as possible, and you can make progress. But I wouldn't actually waste the colony. I would just get rid of the queen.
One of our problems is susceptibility to chalk brood, and of course, in that hive where the bees were, you've got infective material, so that if you're going to do this, you've really got to change the complete hive in the same process. You have got the infective material, but I think the key point actually is the susceptibility of the strain of bee. So in the start of our project at Sussex, we were very keen to introduce new black bees from elsewhere. And in our naivety, we contacted various people, and we had queens from Andrew Abrahams on Colonsay, we had queens from Michael McGillicudder in Ireland, we had bees from Northern Ireland, we had bees from Northumberland, we had bees from elsewhere in Scotland. And I'm sure they were all marvellous bees where they came from, but they didn't do well in Sussex, and they all went down with chalk brood, and within a couple of years we didn't have them anymore. And our own bees didn't have chalk brood. So, the chalk brood must have been there, but our own bees were dealing with it. The strains
even though they were dark bees from elsewhere in Britain and Ireland, couldn't cope with it. So I think it's the susceptibility of the strain that's key, not whether there are spores around. There are probably spores around everywhere.
I'm just wondering what the motivation is for the purchasing of imported bees. Is it purely down to the accessibility and easiness to purchase this, or is it simply price? Or is that a combination of everything?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of those things. I think, when, as I said, when we started the thing at Sussex, we were quite keen to try other black bees, and we got onto lots of people that we knew had black bees and said, could you give us a queen or two? Oh, no, I couldn't possibly spare it, and so on. There are so few people producing decent queens in this country that they're difficult to get hold of, and because of the inherent difficulties of producing this in this country, they tend to be very expensive. And I didn't mention the fact that they're not available at the start of the year generally. So, you either have them later in the season or you have them from someone who's overwintered them, which increases the cost. And these things are coming in very cheaply from abroad. If we could produce good quality local queens ourselves at a decent price, I think that is the best way of stopping imports. But we shouldn't underestimate the amount of work involved in doing that, but it can be done.